I found a relief camp ledger from 1868 that records children not by their names but by assigned numbers. I was researching Civil War-era humanitarian efforts when this document surfaced in a collection of military administrative records housed at the National Archives, buried among routine supply requisitions, personnel transfers, and logistical reports from the post-war Reconstruction period. Standard historical work examining how relief organizations managed displaced populations during and after the Civil War, trying to understand the humanitarian response to one of America's greatest internal crises and the massive population displacements it created across the American landscape. The research had led me through thousands of pages of documentation from charitable organizations, religious groups, government agencies, and military commanders who faced the unprecedented challenge of caring for millions of displaced civilians throughout the former conflict zones. The bureaucratic machinery required to feed, house, and eventually resettle refugee populations had generated extensive documentation about every aspect of humanitarian operations, from food distribution to family reunification efforts to coordination between civilian and military authorities. The ledger I discovered wasn't from a typical refugee camp or aid station that historians routinely study when documenting wartime humanitarian operations and civilian relief efforts. Different facility entirely. A relief camp operated in central Illinois during the summer and fall of 1868, serving communities displaced by what the administrative records describe vaguely as regional disruptions and population relocations, without identifying specific military campaigns, natural disasters, or economic circumstances that would normally explain the need for refugee assistance 3 years after the war's official conclusion. The ledger documents the intake and management of 347 children between the ages of 6 and 14, according to careful estimates, recorded by camp administrators who noted that many children appeared uncertain about their actual ages or birth dates. But instead of recording their names, family connections, places of origin, or any information that would enable tracing their backgrounds and facilitating family reunification, camp administrators systematically assigned each child a numerical identifier. Child 001 through Child 347. No first names that would connect them to family traditions or ethnic heritage. No surnames that would link them to specific communities or regional origins. No documentation of family relationships that would preserve knowledge of siblings, parents, or extended family connections. Just sequential numbers accompanied by basic physical descriptions, including estimated height, weight, hair, and eye color, and notes about general health status and behavioral observations during the intake process. The individual entries in this ledger provide disturbing glimpses into the systematic dehumanization of these children through administrative procedures. Child 047 is described as approximately 8 years, brown hair, green eyes, responds reluctantly to questions about origin, demonstrates advanced reading capabilities, inconsistent with estimated education level. Child 134 is recorded as approximately 11 years, unusual height for age, speaks with unfamiliar accent, maintains reserved demeanor, displays knowledge of multiple languages. Child 289 appears as approximately 9 years, advanced physical development, sophisticated vocabulary, claims no memory of family or previous residence. These entries weren't humanitarian record-keeping designed to facilitate care and family reunification. They were scientific observations documenting characteristics of specimens under institutional study and control. Why would humanitarian workers managing displaced children strip away their most basic human identifier, their names, and replace them with numerical designations that eliminated any possibility of tracing their origins or maintaining their cultural and family identity? The administrative decision to use numbers instead of names represents a fundamental departure from humanitarian principles and suggests institutional purposes that prioritized systematic processing over individual welfare and family preservation. The administrative approach documented in this ledger contradicts everything we know about relief camp operations during the Civil War period. Standard practice for humanitarian organizations involved maintaining detailed records of refugees' identities to facilitate family reunification, coordinate with government agencies, and provide accountability to funding organizations. Children separated from families received special attention to preserve their identity information and increase chances of reunion with surviving relatives. Names were the foundation of humanitarian record-keeping. Without names, children couldn't be traced, families couldn't be reunited, and agencies couldn't demonstrate responsible stewardship of vulnerable populations. The Illinois Relief Camp operated under different principles entirely. The ledger shows systematic procedures designed to obscure rather than preserve identity information. Children entering the facility underwent what administrators called intake processing that included physical examination, health assessment, and assignment of identification numbers, but made no effort to record personal history, family connections, or previous residence. The documentation suggests deliberate severance of children from their past rather than temporary care pending family reunification. The timing connects to broader patterns of population management occurring throughout the Midwest during 1868. The Civil War had officially ended 3 years earlier, but its aftermath continued generating displaced populations throughout former conflict zones. Reconstruction policies were forcing demographic changes in southern states. Industrial development was attracting migration to northern cities. Economic disruption was displacing rural communities. But the 1868 period also marked implementation of new administrative systems for managing populations that couldn't be integrated into standard post-war social and economic structures. Consider the language used in the ledger to describe the children's origins. Rather than specific locations like counties, towns, or states, administrators recorded vague geographical references: northern territories, western settlements, displaced populations from interior regions. These descriptions don't align with standard Civil War refugee patterns, which typically involved clearly identifiable communities fleeing specific military campaigns or occupying armies. The 1868 children seemed to be displaced from areas that administrators either couldn't identify clearly. Time equals 700 milliseconds / or chose not to identify specifically in official records. The physical descriptions recorded for each numbered child are remarkably detailed but focus on characteristics that seem inconsistent with typical refugee populations. Many children are described as unusually tall for estimated age, advanced physical development, or mature comportment suggesting older than documented years. Several entries note unfamiliar clothing styles or personal effects inconsistent with regional norms. These aren't descriptions of ordinary children displaced by war or economic hardship. These are observations suggesting children whose backgrounds didn't align with administrators' expectations for typical refugee populations. The behavioral notes provide additional clues about the children's unusual circumstances. Multiple entries describe children who demonstrate knowledge inappropriate for documented age, display skills suggesting advanced education, or maintain social hierarchies inconsistent with institutional setting. Several children are noted as speaking unfamiliar dialects or using linguistic patterns not consistent with regional norms. These observations suggest children from communities with cultural, practices, or educational systems that didn't align with mainstream American society in 1868. The camp operated using institutional procedures more typical of correctional or medical facilities than humanitarian relief operations. Daily schedules, dietary regulations, and behavioral management systems documented in the ledger emphasize control and containment rather than comfort and family reunification. Children were organized into numbered groups, assigned specific sleeping arrangements, and subjected to daily inspections and assessments. The documentation reveals an institution designed to process and manage children rather than provide temporary assistance pending return to their families or communities. The medical examinations recorded in the ledger were extraordinarily comprehensive and systematic for a relief camp operation, involving procedures that far exceeded what would be necessary for basic humanitarian medical care of displaced children. Each child underwent detailed physical assessment that included precise measurements of height, weight, chest circumference, head circumference, and limb proportions recorded to fractional inches. Comprehensive dental examinations documented not just oral health but tooth development patterns, bite alignment, and dental characteristics that would typically be irrelevant to immediate medical care. Time equals 600 milliseconds greater than but highly relevant to anthropological or scientific study of human developmental patterns and ethnic characteristics. The medical documentation includes detailed recording of distinguishing features, scars, birthmarks, and what the examining physicians described as unusual physical characteristics that suggested genetic or developmental patterns inconsistent with typical American populations. Several children are noted as displaying advanced bone development for documented age or muscle structure inconsistent with regional nutritional patterns. Others are described as having cranial measurements outside normal ranges or skeletal proportions, suggesting different ethnic background than claimed origin. But these comprehensive medical examinations weren't focused on treating injuries, malnutrition, or infectious diseases typical of refugee populations who had experienced displacement, hardship, and inadequate care during emergency circumstances. Instead, the medical assessments documented physical characteristics, developmental patterns, and anatomical features that would be completely irrelevant to humanitarian medical care, but critically important to systematic study of human populations for scientific, anthropological, or administrative classification purposes. The children weren't receiving medical care. They were undergoing scientific examination and documentation as specimens of human variation that required careful measurement and analysis for institutional purposes that the ledger doesn't explicitly identify. The educational assessments documented alongside medical examinations are particularly puzzling when examined in detail, revealing institutional interest in the children's intellectual capabilities that exceeded anything required for basic educational activities typically provided in relief facilities. Standard relief camps might offer rudimentary schooling to maintain children's educational progress during temporary displacement. But the Illinois facility conducted systematic testing of cognitive abilities, knowledge levels, and skill assessments using methodologies that were far more sophisticated than anything required for recreational education or basic literacy maintenance during humanitarian crises. Children were systematically tested for literacy in multiple languages, including English, German, French, and what the assessors described as unidentified linguistic systems that didn't correspond to European languages familiar to the testing administrators. Mathematical capabilities were assessed through complex problem-solving exercises that tested not just basic arithmetic, but advanced computational skills, geometric reasoning, and mathematical concepts that wouldn't be expected among typical rural American children of the 1860s, regardless of their educational background or family circumstances. Most remarkably, children were evaluated for technical knowledge in areas including engineering principles, natural sciences, astronomical observations, and what the assessors described as advanced practical skills in construction, mechanics, and agricultural techniques beyond expected knowledge levels for documented ages and backgrounds. Several children are noted as demonstrating scientific knowledge inconsistent with available educational opportunities or technical capabilities suggesting systematic instruction in advanced subjects. These assessments suggest that the numbered children possessed intellectual development and educational background that far exceeded what would be expected from typical American rural or urban populations during the post-Civil War period, raising fundamental questions about their origins and the communities that had provided their education. Who was funding and operating this facility? And what institutional network had the resources and authority to conduct such systematic processing of child populations outside normal humanitarian oversight and accountability systems? The ledger identifies the camp administration as a joint operation between federal relief agencies and private charitable organizations, but the specific entities aren't named in ways that allow identification through standard historical records of Civil War-era relief work and post-war reconstruction efforts. The institutional structure suggested in the documentation implies coordination between governmental and private interests with financial resources, administrative authority, and logistical capabilities that far exceeded typical humanitarian organizations operating during the Reconstruction period. The level of systematic documentation, medical examination, and institutional organization documented in this ledger would have required substantial funding from sources with both the financial capacity to support extensive operations and the administrative authority to coordinate between federal agencies and private organizations without generating the extensive paper trails that normally characterize governmental and charitable expenditures. The comprehensive medical examinations alone would have required trained physicians, specialized equipment, and systematic record-keeping that represented significant operational expenses for what was supposedly a temporary relief facility serving displaced children. The absence of clear institutional identification in the ledger suggests deliberate obscuring of the organizational structure and funding sources behind this operation. Contemporary relief operations typically maintained detailed records of sponsoring organizations, funding sources, and administrative oversight precisely because accountability to donors, government agencies, and the public was essential for maintaining legitimacy and continued support for humanitarian work. The Illinois relief camp operated according to different principles that prioritized institutional discretion over public accountability and transparency. The absence of family reunification efforts documented in the ledger contradicts the fundamental purpose of relief camp operations. Standard procedure involved active efforts to locate missing family members, coordinate with other relief agencies, and facilitate reunion of separated families. The Illinois camp made no such efforts. No records of family search efforts, no coordination with other agencies, no documentation of successful reunifications. Children entered the facility and remained under institutional management without apparent effort to return them to families or communities of origin. The camp's closure in late 1868 occurred abruptly, without the gradual wind-down typical of relief operations. The final ledger entries simply note facility closure and population transfer without explaining where the numbered children went or what happened to them. No records of children being reunited with families, relocated to other facilities, or integrated into local communities. The 347 children who had been systematically numbered and documented throughout the summer and fall simply disappear from administrative records without explanation or follow-up documentation. The broader context of 1868 reveals similar relief operations throughout the Midwest, all exhibiting characteristics that differed from standard humanitarian practices. Facilities in Ohio, Indiana, and Missouri documented similar populations of children with unusual backgrounds, advanced capabilities, and unclear origins. Not identical operations, but all employing numerical identification systems instead of name-based records, all focusing on detailed documentation of physical and intellectual characteristics, and all terminating their operations around the same time without clear explanation of what happened to the children they had been managing. The pattern suggests coordinated institutional effort to identify, document, and manage child populations whose characteristics or origins were problematic for standard post-Civil War integration into American society. Communities that had existed outside mainstream administrative systems during the war years might have produced children whose cultural background, educational level, or social organization didn't align with expectations for typical American families. The relief camps provided institutional mechanisms for processing such children while determining appropriate long-term solutions for populations that couldn't be easily absorbed into reconstructed society. Consider what happened to children whose communities had been disrupted by forces other than conventional military action. Populations displaced by environmental changes, administrative reorganization, or systematic elimination of alternative social structures that had existed in remote or marginal areas during the chaotic war years. Children from such communities might possess knowledge, skills, or cultural practices that were inconsistent with official narratives about American society and its ethnic composition during the Reconstruction period. The numerical identification system served multiple purposes beyond simple record keeping. Numbers eliminated children's connection to family names that might be traceable to communities or regions that administrators preferred not to acknowledge officially. Numbers prevented children from maintaining cultural identity tied to specific ethnic or regional backgrounds that didn't fit standard American demographic categories. Numbers reduced children to statistical units that could be processed through institutional systems without reference to inconvenient historical contexts or family relationships. The detailed documentation of physical and intellectual characteristics suggests institutional interest in understanding these child populations for purposes that extended beyond immediate humanitarian care. The measurements, assessments, and behavioral observations documented capabilities and characteristics that would be relevant to anthropological study, educational planning, or social engineering projects designed to integrate unusual populations into mainstream American society. The children weren't simply refugees receiving temporary assistance. They were subjects of institutional study and processing. The 1868 Relief Camp Ledger represents one example of how post-Civil War American institutions managed populations whose existence complicated official narratives about American society, ethnic composition, and territorial control. The numbered children might have been remnants of communities that had existed outside mainstream administrative systems during the war years, but that could no longer remain invisible during the systematic reconstruction and documentation efforts that characterized the late 1860s. Modern institutional systems would never process children without maintaining their identity information and family connections. Contemporary humanitarian standards emphasize preserving family relationships, maintaining cultural identity, and ensuring accountability for vulnerable populations. The 1868 relief camp operated according to different priorities that subordinated individual identity to institutional efficiency and administrative convenience. But in historical archives, the ledger remains. Documentation of 347 children processed through systematic institutional procedures that stripped away their names, severed their family connections, and reduced them to numerical designations before transferring them to undocumented destinations. The relief camp provided temporary institutional management for children whose backgrounds were inconsistent with post-war American social expectations, but whose presence couldn't be simply ignored. They were documented, processed, and relocated through systems designed to ensure that their inconvenient existence would be resolved without complicating official reconstruction narratives or accepted demographic understanding of American society. Pitch, just 5%. The numbered children of 1868 represent populations that official American history has no adequate framework to acknowledge or explain. Communities that had existed during the chaotic war years, but that could not be successfully integrated into reconstructed society. Without raising questions about territorial control, ethnic composition, and social organization, that administrators strongly preferred not to address publicly. The Relief Camp Ledger documents the systematic institutional solution. Comprehensive processing that transformed inconvenient children into manageable statistics that could be moved through appropriate administrative systems, without reference to the communities, families, or circumstances that had produced them.